Welcome, everyone. I'm Catherine Morrison, and I'm the Assistant Director and Adult Services Manager here at the Scarborough Public Library. And I'm joined in the room tonight by our Library Director, Nancy Kroll. Also in the room are some members of our Let's Talk America group that engages in civil discourse on a monthly basis here at the library, and also members of Scarborough Community Connections, and they're going to tell you a little bit about their group later. We're very pleased to welcome both an in-person audience. I have a couple of people here in the meeting room at the library with me tonight, and also more people joining from home via Zoom. So welcome again to A Path Forward from Divisiveness, a virtual interview with Mark Gerzon. And before we start tonight's program, we're going to hear a land acknowledgement from the library. The Scarborough Public Library acknowledges that it is located in the traditional homeland, past and present, of tribes in the Wabanaki Confederacy. We recognize and honor the current tribes that comprise the Confederacy, the Penobscot, the Passamaquoddy, the Maliseets, and the Micmac, who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. We acknowledge the Awaskawag people who once lived in what is now Scarborough. We respect the traditional values of these tribes and support their efforts for land and water protection and restoration. In offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty, history, and experiences. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you to the library, to Nancy Kroll, librarian extraordinaire, and Lucy Jackson, who's invited us here and who's asked us to co-sponsor this wonderful event. My name is Dana Morris Jones, one of the founders of what's come to be known as Scarborough Community Connections. It's been almost 4 years now since Janice Cohn, who is also here in the room and you'll be hearing from in a bit, decided to try to do something a little bit radical in our own community. Both of us are very invested personally and professionally in creating civil societies in which people work together to build community and to solve problems. We've done this professionally all our careers, and living in Scarborough, we looked around and we thought, you know, it's not really all happening as well as we would like it to right here in our very own community. And if we're dedicated to this, how can we not try to do something to make our own community stronger and healthier? So in the time since then, began about early 2018, since then we sort of inadvertently created this organization. We didn't really set out to create an organization, but a little organization evolved. It's called, again, Scarborough Community Connections. And we facilitated a number of meetings, some, of course, in person, and then because of COVID, we went to virtual. But over those years, we had lots of really wonderful conversations and created some great opportunities. Just to be clear, when we talk about building civil societies and helping people collaborate, we're not at all saying that disagreement or differences are a problem. Quite the contrary. Having differences of opinion is a sign of a healthy community. It's necessary. It's not about having the differences, it's about how we choose to address them. Whether we go about dealing with differences by listening to one another, sorting out our differences, trying to find ways to solve problems that are good for everybody, or on the contrary, if we allow our differences to become destructive, to get in the way of that problem solving, and actually sometimes destroy relationships and destroy communities. And we just don't want that to happen. I think Scarborough actually has done pretty darn well in the recent past. I wish we could say the same about our country as a whole. We look around us and I think we all are feeling a little bit disheartened. And I think we're concerned that the mood at the national level can always kind of trickle down and infect us. And I thought about that word long and hard, given COVID, if I really wanted to use the word infect. But I think actually it's pretty appropriate because it is almost like a disease that can infiltrate the way we think about our neighbors, our friends, our families when we have differences. So being of that mind, we were thrilled when Lucy Jackson and Nancy Crowell asked us to co-sponsor an event that would talk about those very issues. And we're thrilled that we're going to have Mark Gerzon with us tonight. Janice is going to tell you quite a lot more about Mark. But after Mark's presentation, which is Lucy is going to be having a discussion with Mark that we're all going to get to listen in on. And following that, we're going to have some time to talk in small groups about the thing that I've been talking about, really what does this have to do with us in Scarborough? And how can we make sure that we keep our own community working in a collaborative and a healthy and positive way? So I hope you'll stick around for that conversation. And here's Janice to introduce you to Mark.
Oh, I can take my mask off. I'm happy now. In August, Lucy Jackson Norvell, who is a coordinator for communication and programming at the Scarborough Public Library, contacted me and said, do you know if there's an expert that could come to Scarborough and talk to us about conflict resolution? Immediately, it came to mind as Mark Gerzon. And when we invited Mark and he said yes, we were extremely happy and knew that we would have a good evening. Since his student years at Harvard, Mark has demonstrated his passion for helping people in different values, people of different values, beliefs, and culture find ways to work together peacefully. In his early career, he was a citizen diplomat working to bring Soviet and American civic leaders together, a UN advisor on leadership development, and the head facilitator for the US bipartisan congressional retreats in the 1990s. I think they need you again, Mark. I first met Mark while attending a workshop on conflict resolution in the early 90s. I was in the process of starting an Institute for Civic Leadership, but hadn't realized the immense shift required to move from a top-down command and control form of leadership to a process of engaging people so that they could find solutions to problems that they shared. Mark shared the principles that guide collaboration and the skills needed to create constructive conversations. More importantly, he taught me it is not necessary to agree in order for us to resolve our differences. Despite the divisiveness we see around us today, Mark hasn't given up. He has shared his deep knowledge and experience in several books. One of them, his latest, The United States of America, How We Can Bridge the Partisan Divide, is the catalyst for a film which we believe, Mark can correct me, that's going to be shown on PBS in January. Some of you may have come to the or zoomed into the showing of the film last January when the Scarborough Community Connections hosted it. Today's world is in desperate need of Mark's teachings and his knowledge. He is, and we need those to be incorporated into our governments, into our corporations, and into our neighborhoods. Like Mark, I am convinced that ending divisiveness in our culture starts right here with each of us taking responsibility, how we connect with others, and how we perceive those whom we think are different than ourselves. My thanks to everyone in the audience for attending this presentation, and to Mark, who has agreed to bring his wisdom and experience in conflict resolution to Scarborough. And with that, I turn it over to you.
Mark, we're so glad to have you here. Thank you very much for coming. I know it's a windy night in Colorado, so, but your sound sounded terrific earlier. We're really eager to dive in and hear what you have to say in response to a few questions. And the first one I want to ask is, what do you think the most important tool citizens need to navigate through this time of intensifying polarization is?
Well, hi, Lucy. Thanks so much for the question, and good evening to everybody in Scarborough. The word that came to me, the first word that came to me was humility. The second one that came to me was curiosity. And the third one that came to me when you asked the question was learning. Humility, curiosity, and learning. And I'm struck by the fact that those were the first three words that went through my head. Because I think, my father was a chemist. He worked in a laboratory. He was a very, very curious man. He worked for Eli Lilly and Company. He would always do chemistry experiments in his lab, trying to make medicines that would help people. And I think that probably had an effect on me, because I do see Scarborough and other communities like Scarborough States as laboratories. They're laboratories to see if we can solve problems, And so what you all have been doing in Scarborough has been a beautiful laboratory. And I felt those qualities in you: humility, curiosity, learning. Nobody's saying, we've got the answer for Scarborough. We need to just stop growing, or we need to start growing, or we need to all become Republicans. We all need to become, I hear none of that kind of arrogance in your community. I'm hearing a lot of humility and curiosity. So those are the things that come to me. And for those of you who've seen my book, The Reunited States of America, the first chapter is called Learning, because what I was struck by when I took upon myself the challenge to describe the kind of movement for bridging America or uniting America, I was struck by the fact that most of the people that I respect, including my colleague Chris Gates, who's on this call, people I respect are people who want to learn. They don't say, "Oh, I've got the answer to internet privacy," or "I've got the answer to the immigration crisis," or "I've got the answer to how to teach history in K through 12 schools. I've got the answer to everything." I don't hear that quality. I hear curiosity, humility, and learning. So those are the words that come to my mind, Lucy.
Out, please bring them to the front desk in the next few minutes.
Sorry, you hear a little bit of library announcement in the background. Sorry about that.
All right.
At what point does healthy disagreement become destructive polarization? And a little follow-up question to that: when and how does it become a sense of otherness that prevents constructive discussion and problem solving?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for me, disagreement is sort of the first of 5 levels. I won't go through all 5, but it's the first level where you go, "Oh, I disagree with you." My wife wants to go see a movie, and I don't want to go see the movie. I want to stay home, and we disagree. Not a big problem so far. Not a big problem so far. But where it becomes a problem is if I then say, or she says, "You just want to stay home because you've just become a total introvert." And then I say, "Well, I just like to be together at home, and you're just afraid of intimacy." Suddenly, it's no longer a disagreement. Now it's a disagreement with stories attached, and I would add judgment. I have suddenly judged her, and she's judged me, and suddenly that polarization happens right here in my own home. So I think the answer for me is, when does disagreement start becoming wedded to personal attacks and personal judgments and us versus them kind of mentality? Because obviously a couple could say, "I'm a little tired today. Let's stay home tonight, but I'm open to that movie tomorrow." Suddenly, they've disagreed and they've worked it through. Now, I'm obviously oversimplifying by talking about a couple. Democracy is far more complicated, but I'm just illustrating it in a simple way because I was trained as a family therapist originally, because I was interested in getting back to the root of conflict. And for me, the only one thing I knew was that most Democrats and most Republicans, we started out in families. And so I think that's probably why I gravitated, and why, by the way, in this call, you'll probably notice that I will speak psychologically as well as politically, because I've had as much experience in the psychological realm. And I think a lot of the issues we're going to be talking about, Lucy, including this one, are psychological. Why does a couple turn whether they should go out to movie or not to ad hominem attacks. Why are they start attacking each other and polarizing? Because that's a psychological issue. There's a psychology, and what I'm noticing in our culture right now is that, and COVID has made this a lot worse, I think. There's a lot of isolation, there's a lot of loneliness, there's a lot of mistrust, there's a lack of belonging. And that's a psychological context in which politics happens. And I think the psychological context in which we're happening during this COVID era is making us politically far more volatile and far more likely to take that next step, Lucy, from disagreement to real discord and polarization.
Thank you. The national divisiveness that's happening now, how do you think that filters down and affects local levels? And what can each of us do to prevent that from happening in Scarborough?
Yes, well, it goes back to that metaphor I used of a laboratory. If Scarborough is a laboratory, if Maine is a laboratory, you're really asking the question of how does Washington in the national kind of context, how does that make us start to mistrust each other and contaminate in a way our laboratory? And I think what you're doing in Scarborough is super important because you're creating a pride of place. You're saying what happens, what matters, what happens here matters. What happens here matters. How we treat each other here matters. And you're focusing people's attention on the local community. And I think that's an incredibly powerful step because the truth is when people turn on their CNN or their Fox or their MSNBC at night, they don't see the Scarborough City Council. You know, they see Washington, in other words, and it's the same way, you know, kids, they're not watching their local sports teams. They're not watching local, you know, basketball and high schools playing. They're usually watching, you know, the National Football League. They're watching the NBA. So those major leagues affect the way people in the minor leagues play and the way that affects then the way kids think they're supposed to play Little League and it filters down. And I think the same thing's happening in our culture. When we see people in Washington talk a certain way and fight a certain way, we think, well, that's how it's supposed to be done. So what you're doing in Scarborough, I think, is fantastic, which is you're creating a sense of what's the Scarborough ethos? How do we treat each other? What are our ground rules? You know, what's our way of dealing with differences? I think that's super important because my feeling is that percolating upward is just as important as percolating downward. And so I'm really hoping that we see some communities and some states. And I've said this in Michigan and Arizona and other places where I've worked. I've said, you know, let's see what Arizona can teach the country about working together. Let's see what Michigan can teach the country about working together. That attitude, and I think Maine would be a great place to do that. What can Maine teach the country about working together? That to me is a sign, would be a sign of hope because we do have 50 laboratories, and not every country is, you know, built that way. Now, there's a lot of problems in that, by the way. It means that states can make different rules about COVID. They can make different rules about masks. They can make different rules about abortion. They can make all sorts of different rules, and it becomes a kind of a chaotic hodgepodge. I understand the downside. But the upside is we have states with a certain amount of autonomy. And I'd love to see Scarborough and Maine really be an innovator. And in many ways, you know, in some ways you have been. In other ways, you've, you know, the national scene has contaminated you. So that's a general answer, Lucy, but I'm glad to dive deeper in. I just want to share one personal experience. Back a couple decades ago, I started a project called Healthy Campaigns for Healthy Communities. And the concept was, if you want to come and campaign in our area, here are our ground rules. If you want to campaign, here's the kind of tone we would like. Here's the kind of way we'd like people to behave. And just know that that's who we are. You're welcome to come and campaign. And I that was my way, Lucy, of kind of answering your question of saying, how can a community assert its values so that instead of having these Democrats or Republicans come in and kind of divide you against each other, you're kind of saying, hey, we're Scarborough, you know, you're welcome to come, but when you do, here's how we'd like you to talk to us and how you'd like to talk about your adversary and talk about yourself. It's a pretty simple concept, but I think it's an important one because otherwise we have this injection of poison every 2 and 4 years into our civic cultures. I say poison, not because it's just disagreement, because it's often very toxic disagreement and polarized So feel free to dive in deeper on that, Lucy, if you want to.
I would. Thank you for that concept and the story too. It was really interesting. You used a term, percolate up, which is a really sort of a powerful verb. Can you say more about percolate up and maybe even give us a couple of illustrations?
Yeah. I mean, I'm just giving you my first reaction is, both Chris and I have seen in a number of settings, people show a video from Idaho about a town where there were some anti-Semitic activities, and I think somebody threw a rock through a window that had a menorah in it or something like that, because there weren't very many Jews in this town. I can't remember if it was Missoula or Boise, one of those two, either Missoula, Montana, or Boise, Idaho. I can't remember. And the entire town basically put menorahs in their windows, and then they had a march, and it was a way of saying, this is who we are. This is who we are. We as a town are not anti-Semitic. And I've seen other towns do that around racism against Black people. I've seen other people do that around gender justice. I've seen other people do that about Native American issues. When a community stands together, and why do I know that story? Why is that story often talked about at meetings? Why do people show videos or photographs from that example? They do it because that percolated upward. It percolated upward. And I bet all of you have stories about, you've read this story or that story about a community that's done something remarkable. And why do they? And that's often the closing story on the evening news. They'll put that positive, uplifting story from a community as the closing story on the news to offset all the negative stories, which are usually national stories, although not always. Now we have to remember that, what happened in Bismarck, Georgia, what happened in Ferguson, Missouri, when there's the mass killing that just happened in Oxford, Michigan, those are also local stories. So those stories are also percolating upward, but they're negative stories percolating upward. And what we need are more positive stories percolating upward that say, this is how this community solved that issue. This is how this community dealt with that problem. That to me is, we need more of that positive story percolating upward. Great question, Lucy, thank you.
Sure. So the nature of the national news is to report on very serious problems, which causes some people not to tune into news or to tune into news differently. Do you have thoughts about how other communities have effectively shared positive stories, Mark?
How they've shared it with the nation or how they shared it with each other?
First with each other, I guess, and then with the nation.
Yeah, well, what you're doing, the local projects you're doing in Scarborough are actually examples of, I think, what I've seen other communities do. It always takes a nucleus, which I think it's happened in Scarborough. It takes a nucleus of people, preferably a diverse nucleus, who say we have to take what happens in our community more serious. We have to focus our attention on our community. And I think that's a major first step, because you find out then, do people care? And I think I remember in previous conversations, you had to define the Scarborough region a certain way. You didn't define it inside of city limits. You defined it in a more regional way. And I think, how do you define it? And then what are the issues that you focus on? Those are all super important steps. And I think that's what allows a community to start communicating internally about what's going on that's positive and creating positive story. How you get it out of your community is much more challenging, because you've probably noticed that positive stories don't get the same traction in the news as negative. There's been a lot of research about that lately. And for me, that's just one of the great challenges. I have not solved that issue. And with the current crisis around Facebook, et cetera, you probably all know that there's now data that shows that stories that make you angry get clicked on more and travel faster than stories that don't make you angry. So that's an example of, how social media is using the way our brains are wired to get us to focus attention. So getting people in Scarborough to focus on Scarborough, and getting people in Scarborough to focus on how to make things better and share that with each other, that's a major civic organizing That's one of the reasons we're on this Zoom call tonight, is because you're doing that. And that's one of the reasons I want to be a part of it, because it doesn't happen everywhere all the time. And if I can make a suggestion, I would say, have somebody in Scarborough start researching. Are there other communities in Maine that are doing this? And if you want to take a bigger scope, are there other communities in New England? And create a network of communities that are all taking this challenge on, because that's the way you go to scale. Because if nothing else, let's say you found another 8 communities in Maine or another 20 communities in New England, you would be sharing stories amongst the network. Well, right there, you're spreading your story to others, and they're spreading their stories to you. So I'd encourage you to think about, what do you stand for, and networking with other people who are trying to stand for the same thing. That's in a way what's happening with the movement that Chris and I are a part of, what we sometimes call the transpartisan movement, or the movement to reunite America, or the bridging movement. It's basically like-minded souls who are trying to do what you're doing, saying, let's connect with each other. Otherwise, you have these vast networks connecting on the left, you have these vast networks connecting on the right, and people who are bridging, they always feel alone. And so that's one of the reasons I'm grateful for the work you're doing in Scarborough.
Thank you. It's really nice to have some encouragement from you, Mark. And switching gears just a little, I mean, thinking about encouragement. Given the increasing divisiveness locally and nationally these days, I'm interested in what gives you hope about the reuniting of America.
Well, it's interesting, because I think Janice's introduction said, Mark's been at this a long time and he hasn't given up. I thought, well, it's true. I wouldn't be on the call if I'd given up, but there are days, I've got to tell you, where I feel disheartened. That was another word you used in the introduction, disheartened. And I guess one of the reasons I haven't given up is that, there are groups like you all over the country who are doing what you do. And the fact that you don't get covered in the news and you don't get, as much prime time, that doesn't change the fact that I know those groups are out there. So it's partly other people, but I also think it's my sense about people in general and Americans is that when things get bad to a certain point, we sometimes call it a crisis, we often wake up. And I think, I have the hope that we're starting to wake up, because we are in a crisis. 2016 and 2020 were the worst election years in my lifetime. And I'm not saying 2000 was easy with Gore and Bush and that close election. And I'm not saying there weren't other acrimonious elections. I remember 1968 and the violence in 1968. I'm old enough to remember that. But 2016 and 2020 were definitely the low point. And as we head into 22 and 24, I think it's going to be a crisis. And when Chris and I started out in this work years and years ago, we would say, we have a problem. And people would say, well, it's not really that bad. And 10, 15 years ago, we'd say, well, this is a serious problem. And say, some people would say, yes, it is. But now almost everybody says, yeah, this is a serious problem, which is why, I think, 2/3 of the people say the country's going in the wrong direction. So people have a sense now that this is a crisis. So I guess my hope, paradoxically, Lucy, comes from the fact that when things are a crisis, I'm impressed. I'm impressed with my fellow citizens. When the banks of the Mississippi flood, or Hurricane Katrina, I'm just impressed in crisis the way people step forward. And I know that's not a very, what should we say, Pollyannish reaction, but it's the truth. And you might be asking after this call, was Mark saying things are going to get worse before they get better? Possibly. But I do think we know when we hit a crisis, and you probably all know that the Chinese word for crisis has two characters, danger and opportunity. And I think as we see the danger more clearly, we're more likely to seize the opportunity.
It's wonderful to hear, to have a chance to hear more what.
Well, and if I could just add one more word too, that I don't know those who've seen the film, most of you've seen the film. There's a couple in the film who start out Republicans, two Republicans who start out in Dallas, Texas, and they just say, "Oh, we want to get to know the country," and I, you know, their story is one of basically waking up. You know, they modeled the kind of humility and curiosity that I talked about, and they were profoundly changed by their year of listening and learning. And they were just an ordinary, pretty ordinary Dallas Republican couple. I'm very touched by the fact that they shared their story in the United States film about how they woke up. And I think there are a lot of people who are waking up. Most of them don't have a film made about them. You know, the cameras are pointed to the person who shoots other kids at his high school. The camera is pointed at a congresswoman who, you know, talks trash about her colleagues. The camera is pointed at, you know, the players who pick a fight at the end of the NBA basketball game. That's where the camera's pointed. But we just have to make sure our attention is pointed at the light.
Do you have any other stories? You refer to the couple from Texas. Are there any related stories that you would like to share?
Of hope, you're talking about of hope?
Of hope.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, for me, you know, just I don't want to talk too much about the film, but I wrote that book in 2016. I'm in my 70s. The people who made the film are all in their 30s. They live in Los Angeles, and they're ethnically and politically diverse. And I didn't make that film. You know, they did. So there was a picking up of the baton by a whole other set of people. They spent 3 years and you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars of their own money and other people's money to make that film. And to me, that's a small sign. And then even the PBS airing you mentioned, which you mentioned in the introduction, that PBS would pick the film to be released on January 6th. You know, that to me is a sign of hope. You know, and when I look at some of the books that are on the bestseller list, and some of the plays that are being performed in New York now, and I look at some of the themes, and it's like there's a waking up happening. And I'll, if you don't mind, I'm going to refer back to your land acknowledgement at the beginning, because 5 or 10 years ago, the Scarborough Public Library would not have started with a land acknowledgement. Now, there's some people who would consider that, you know, politically correct or trendy or, you know, whatever. But I'm just saying, you see signs all across our culture of change, of people saying, I'm going to do this a little differently. I'm going to take a different stand on that. So, you know, my own wish, and it is a wish, is that more and more people will become part of this this movement. And you know, I don't know the current figures, but when I last checked, it was 42% of Americans called themselves independents, not Democrats or Republicans. Now, I'm not sure where that figure stands now, but that's to me also, Lucy, a sign of hope. You know, there's 42% of the people have said, you know, and some of them, of course, are closet Democrats and closet Republicans, but they just, you know, don't want to say it. But a lot of them are people, I think, like us, who are kind of going, that fighting between the red and the blue, I may be more blue or I may be more red, but that way of fighting isn't getting us anywhere. And Chris and I just finished writing a piece for the Fulcrum. I don't know, I think if you want to look at it, go to fulcrum.org. But we just basically finished saying that, you know, that most people realize that you know, left running things for 4 or 5 or 6 years, and then the right running things for years, and that careening back and forth, that's not getting us in a coherent direction. That's not moving us in a coherent direction. So I think more and more people, and I'll close with this, Lucy. Here's a concrete positive story. We started an organization 5 or 6 years ago called Bridge USA. And when I say we helped some young people on campuses start Bridge USA. And they just called me today and said, by the way, Forbes magazine is giving us, we are in the next issue of Forbes magazine. We are one of the 30 organizations under 30 that they are honoring in Forbes magazine. Well, 6 years ago, Bridge USA didn't exist. 7 years ago, there were not organizations on campus for Democrats and Republicans to come together. There were Republican clubs and Democratic clubs. So and Seekers have gone from being just an idea to now being an organization on campuses across the country that's just been acknowledged by Forbes magazine. So, is this am I saying everything's going to be fine now? No, but if you want a positive story, that's a very positive one, and it's and I'm really proud of the Bridge USA crew for doing what they've done.
Congratulations, actually, to you and to Chris and to all of the young people who made that happen. That's a beautiful story. At this point, Mark, I know that there are people on the call who have questions that they would like to ask you. And so what I'm going to do is invite those questions now in a very specific way for the people who are assembled in our meeting room with Catherine Morrison and Nancy Kroll. Catherine will be collecting questions, and she will pose the question to you. And to give her a chance to do that, I'm going to ask the first question from the virtual audience. And the way that you can get a question to me is by chatting to the hosts and co-hosts your question. And we'll answer as many questions as we can until it's time for us to break up into our small facilitated group discussions. We're really excited about the facilitators who we have here tonight, and in combination with your inspirational words, we're looking forward to people's experience in the second hour. But let's see if we've got any questions coming in here. And I see Catherine is pulling some together for where she is. So.
Well, we're working on some questions here, but could you tell us more about when the film is going to be released and where we can watch it?
Well, right now you can watch it on Amazon Prime.
Okay.
It's been on Amazon Prime for past years. So if you're impatient and you have Amazon Prime, watch it. But the way I believe it works is that PBS releases it to their affiliates. Then I think the affiliates have the prerogative to run it or not run it. And those who choose to run it will run it in January. So I would just check your local, but in the meantime, if you really want to watch it, just go to Amazon Prime. And yeah, and I'll just say this about the film, that I guess what I appreciate about the film was there was a film festival where the person who chose to put it at the film festival called me and said, yes, we're showing the film. He said there were a number of people who said they didn't want us to show political films because they wanted us to focus on artistic films. He said, I didn't consider the Reunited States political. And I said, well, that's really interesting. Why didn't you consider it political? He said, because it was about the human heart and how people changed. And I thought that was one of the most kindest compliments about the film I've ever heard. He said it wasn't political. It was about people's hearts and how they changed. And so I'll share that with you because I was struck by it. And I think that's probably a key to why this transpartisan movement might be gaining some traction, is that people are realizing that it's not just a question of your mind, where you are on the political, left, right, center scale. Is your heart open to other people who differ from you, or is your heart closed? And what I loved about the film is that it shows people's hearts opening. So Lucy, you got some questions for us?
Yes. Here's the first one from John. I understand that people will often come together in a crisis, but how have you actually seen communities inspire engagement and conversations in a non-crisis situation to create a culture that is open and willing to engage with each other? What advice do you have to us to help with that more proactively rather than waiting for the next crisis?
Well, I'm curious to hear John say more, because my sense is that Scarborough's done just that. Now, you could say Scarborough's had a crisis, as I understand it, in this whole growth versus non-growth. How much do we develop and how much do we not? That's an issue that a lot of cultures, a lot of small local communities are dealing with. But I think you've in fact already done that. And when we say that there's not a crisis, I mean, I just want to say, I mean, people, you know, the climate crisis hitting us in 2030 or 2040 or 2050. But I know people personally who the climate crisis has already hit. So my feeling is, if we're really sensitive to what's going on in our communities, there's a crisis right now. I don't know in your community whether it's going to be the opioid crisis or whether it's the crisis of, you know, of sprawl, or whether it's the crisis of poverty, or whether it's the crisis of, you know, animosity and disagreement about public policy issues. But if we're sensitive to what's going on in our community and we open our hearts to each other, there are people who are already in a crisis right now. So I think it's to me, it's, you know, if we open our hearts to what's happening in our own backyards, there's reasons to get together right now. So I appreciate John's question, because when I said crisis, I don't mean it has to be Hurricane Katrina or, you know, the kind of crisis that's covered in the national newspaper. I personally consider much of New England to be having an opioid and drug crisis right now in their communities. I consider communities having a poverty crisis in their community right now. I have a political dysfunction crisis in their community right now. So I agree with you, John. We shouldn't wait till crisis, but I think if we open our hearts and our eyes and our minds, we'll realize that there's a crisis happening in our community right now for some people. And it's a question of recognizing that. I mean, and I'll just close by saying, you know, some people thought, oh yeah, George Floyd, that's what caused us to have a race crisis in America. There was a race crisis long before George Floyd. It's just, when do we open our eyes to the crisis that's in front of our, right under our nose? And I think people like Chris and me and others in the movement, we tended to see this crisis of political dysfunction. I saw it in the 1990s. I saw the crisis in the 1990s, and I wrote a book called A House Divided, 6 Belief Systems Struggling for America's Soul. And I wrote that book in 1996 because I saw America coming apart in 1996. That's a quarter century ago. So, and I believe there are people who saw the race. I mean, so I'm inviting you, be a forerunner and realize the crisis that someone else is going to see in 10 or 20 years. Look at it right now, you know, look at it right now, because it's right there.
Thank you. Sally says, short of being invaded by another star system, not much has brought the world together. Why has climate change not been a true crisis?
Oh, yeah, that's a really good question, Sally. That's a really good question. And the closing sentence of the question was, why has it not been a true crisis? And I would say, why has it not yet been a true crisis? Because when you look at what happened at the COP meeting in Scotland, there were people speaking there who were losing their islands, that are losing their land base. There are places in Africa that have lost their food supply. There are places that are now completely drought stricken. There are places in Alaska where the towns are having to move inland because the ocean has moved in on them. There are places in the western part of the United States where I live, where people have lost their homes to fire, where the entire forest line has gone from being green to red in terms of beetle kill, pines with beetle kill. So I guess this illustrates the point I was just making to John's question, which is that the climate crisis is here right now. It's here right now for some people. Now, like you, I live in Boulder, Colorado, you live in Scarborough. You're not feeling it. You're not feeling it in a life and death way. I'm not feeling it in a life and death way, but we're all feeling it. We're all feeling it. And I'll tell you that the number of days last summer that I felt smoke in my lungs was devastating. It started to be a real health concern. And what I was struck by, and I'll close with this to your beautiful question, Sally, the smoke doesn't just affect poor people. The smoke doesn't just affect minorities. When the forest fires come in, it doesn't care how rich you are or how white you are or how privileged you are. And I felt a shift here because we were talking about something that you cannot buy your way out of. You could not buy your way out of the smoke in the air. Yes, you can put a water filter in your sink and have clean water while someone else doesn't, but you can't get your own oxygen. Well, I mean, I guess you can have an oxygen tank, but basically you can't have your own oxygen supply. So I think climate change is starting to shift, and it's becoming an equal opportunity offender. And I think as it becomes an equal opportunity that we have never seen before. And again, it's going back to the earlier question. Yes, it's going to be a crisis that makes us change. And if anybody can rewire the human brain, please do. Make us respond to things prior to crisis.
Thank you. I see Catherine has a question.
Question from the room. Is the organization that you and Chris started, the Bridge Civic Groups, planning to bring their combined message to Congress advocating for civil discourse?
Well, first, let me clarify. Chris and I co-lead a project called Philanthropy Bridging Divides, which is one of many, many organizations in the bridging movement. If any of you want an overview of the bridging movement, I would go to bridgealliance.org. And Bridge Alliance, I think it's bridgealliance.org, or maybe it's bridgealliance.us. But put in Bridge Alliance, you'll get it. That's over 100 organizations that do bridging work. And for example, your own organization in Scarborough could join the Bridge Alliance if you haven't. That's an organization that we started here at Mediators in 2014. And we started it here because we saw lots of different organizations that were, all competing for scarce nonprofit money and all trying to create their own niche. And we wanted to have more of a sense of movement. So your question about, are we going to Congress and asking them to, kind of advocate for civil discourse, that gets us back to the local national thing. I don't want to sound cynical, but I will sound cynical, because I'm going to say, what difference would it make if Congress mandated civil discourse? Seriously, what difference would it make? And my fear is that they would say something, lofty and noble about civil discourse, and that it could create the exact opposite effect, which is, how can you tell us to speak in civil ways? Look at how you're behaving. So what I noticed about Congress, and I think this is an important thing to say, since a lot of people in this field have a lot more experience than I do, but I have had a lot of experience with Congress, very intimate experience. And what I saw was that the system was designed to create hyperpolarization. The system was designed to create hyperpolarization. So when we say it's broken, I would say it's not broken. It's functioning exactly the way it's now set up to function, which is that if you're a Democrat or Republican and you want to work together with someone else, much less an independent like your senator, if you're trying to advocate working together, you're vilified, you're penalized by your party chair. So there's an incredible disincentive to working together. So I don't think Congress can exhort the American people to be more civil until they learn to be more civil themselves, and they will not learn until they change their incentive system. If you say to your teenager, if you never clean your room, I'll double your allowance, I guarantee you they will not clean their room. If you say, I'll double your allowance if you clean your room, they might clean their room. So we need to change the incentive structure. And that's where we come in. And that's where the Scarboroughs of America come in, because you're changing the incentive structure locally now. You're saying, hey, let's do this, let's work together. And then suddenly people, oh, I'm going to have a better life if I work with my adversary than I will if I polarize with my adversary. That's what we need to do on the local level, is let people realize their lives are going to be better if they work with people they disagree.
Thank you for that.
Thank you, Catherine.
Anyone else have any questions in the room they'd like to pass on?
Well, I have a question for you, unless there's somebody there. My question for you is, and for the small groups that are about to meet, is what are you going to do next in your community to make your work more relevant to more people? What are you going to do next in your community to make your work more relevant to more people? That's a question I'd really be curious for you to look at in 2022, because I see 2022 as a very turning point, and I'll leave that. But anyway, Lucy, did you get more questions, or I don't want to interfere with questions from the audience. I just want to throw that out to you, all of you.
Mark, I wanted just to say, one of the nice things, and John Anderson can speak to this too, is that Dana and I have been invited to speak to the town's communications committee about how we engage people in the decisions that affect our community.
Beautiful, beautiful. That's wonderful. Congratulations. And just let me say that in that spirit, I attended a meeting on Friday here in Boulder, Colorado, where I live, where the mayor was there, several city council people there, were some county commissioners there, and a number of other people from the city government. And why were we gathered together? Because the chief of the Southern Arapaho had come to speak to us about the Arapaho and their desire to have a piece of land in this valley, which once belonged entirely to them. And the whole conversation was about how can some land in this beautiful valley where we live, how can some land, 100 acres, 200 acres, how can it be back in the hands of the Arapaho, so they have a place to stay when they drive through this area, or they have a place to plant crops and educate the local people about, and have a summer camp for their kids. And I'm just mentioning that because, that's another, to me, hopeful story right here. And it's a sign, just like you said, you're speaking to the city council. That's fantastic. Chief of Arapaho was speaking to our city council people, our county commissioners, and our mayor. And it was a privilege to be in the room with them, because I thought finally these issues are getting the attention that they deserve. So I'm saying that because we started with the land acknowledgement, and I wanted to end with a quick story about our community, which is not only doing a land acknowledgement, but is exploring doing a land transfer.
That's a really beautiful and inspirational story.
Thank you.
Mark, thank you.
Yeah, well, I'll just mention, lest you think that we're a generous community, we have 45,000 acres of open space in Boulder County, 45,000 acres. And we're talking about a 100-acre parcel that would belong to the Arapaho. So, it's a very small first step, but it is a first step towards being in right relationship. And let me just close, unless you've got another question for me, Lucy, just to say, the organization that's doing that work is called Right Relationship. And I think what you're all doing in Scarborough, when I meet all of you and I listen to all of you, what I hear is you're saying, how can we be in right relationship to each other in our community? And that's something that I think goes across the political spectrum. Everybody, when they hear the phrase right relationship, they goes, yeah, that sounds right. I'd like to be in right relationship to my neighbors. And I think that's what you all are standing for. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you so much for answering all of our questions. You answered a lot of questions in the time that you have been speaking, and we have captured a recording of you, so we'll be able to share it with even more people. What's going to happen right now is participants are going to be divided into some small groups to have facilitated discussion. And we have a number of facilitators who will introduce to you later. You'll meet your facilitator in your small group, and there are people who will be in a group in the library. There are people, and then several groups virtually, and we will all come back together at 8:15. So if you can pay attention to the clock, that'll be great. We'll send you a couple of reminders. And my colleague, Tom Corbett, our systems librarian, will be dropping in quickly on the breakout groups just to make sure that they're fairly evenly populated. And so we will see everybody now at back at 8:15, where we'll hear the facilitators report out briefly, and then we will we'll end. And thank you so much for coming, and I hope you enjoy the next part of the program tonight. So our first facilitator to do that is John Anderson.
Yep. Thanks, Lucy, and thanks to the group I had for a really great conversation and discussion. So just to share some of the controversial issues or crises that we discussed in our group. One was around the concern around quick and thoughtless development, concern around rising sea levels, the general political climate, which was made worse by the pandemic in general, open hostility expressed between elected officials at the town council level, race concerns and non-acceptance of people who are different, and then just the general fall of civility and the creation of the civil divide. We chose to kind of dig into development to talk about, what we saw as the root cause of the divisiveness within the town around development. One potential root cause was the perception that there's a unwillingness to listen, to see other viewpoints, and that's come from experiences where that one individual had seen in a different community a true willingness and action as a result of listening to constituents. Just in general, there is a general lack of communication or communication challenge, and it's really challenging to mobilize certain groups, especially those who just are not engaged or involved and don't care. And that's a big challenge, is how do you get people engaged and involved before it becomes a personal issue for them. Another thing that leads to the root cause a little bit is through past experience, meaning there's been things that have been done that, in the past, kind of demonstrate a lack of confidence in terms of how development has been handled. Simple things about just trying to get basic information and the difficulty in getting it just erodes confidence that the right information is there and available in decision making, and so that can create issues. What led people to kind of being more introspective about why they had those views? Some of it came down to what they valued. So when it comes to concerns around growth, one individual very much valued education and public safety and felt like those maybe aren't getting as much attention as they should and could. Again, some looked to past experience where they had a really good experience in another community where there was clear evidence and action that was taken, and they're not seeing that same level of action within our community, as well as not being able to answer basic questions. In terms of how do we reduce our divisiveness, I think it was unanimous that doing more of these types of conversations is very helpful. Though there's a challenge in some cases of making sure that these groups and conversations are diverse, that it's not the same type of people talking to each other, and really trying to figure out how do you pull in those, especially who are so entrenched in their way of thinking, so that they could actually be part of the conversation. That's what we got from our group.
I had the great fortune of working with a group who were less anchored in Scarborough specific polarization and more into polarization that our society faces in general. So I'll speak to that in summary. That it is really centered in relationships and maintaining and building relationships across differences, and to do that open-heartedly, to do it with love, with compassion, and the recognition that it takes courage actually to stay in those relationships, particularly when people, even with your own perspectives, may discourage you from staying in relationship with others, and that this ability to polarize can come from any one of us at any given time. We spoke about how in some ways it's the small work that's the big work. It's single relationships with single people, it's raising a child, it's engaging in the community as a foster grandparent, that small work is the big work, both the impact on others and the impact on ourselves. And then we carried forward a number of questions kind of to offer up to the organizers of this too, and to everyone, the community. which is along the lines of what John mentioned. How do we reach those that aren't here? How do we reach those that when they read a description of this evening say, no thanks, or maybe, but then drop off the call right before the small groups start? Because it takes courage and to have this conversation. And so how do we reach those folks wherever they are to engage them in this conversation? How do we find them? How do we reach them? And we also talked about the decline, the general decline in civic spaces, civic life, and how could Scarborough create and recreate and bolster more civic spaces, virtually, physically, architecturally, where we meet people from all walks of life. And then lastly, just to continually self-reflect on the moments that we might be inhibited from building the bridge. Where do we stop reaching across? Even those of us that are committed to this work. Hopefully that was a concise summary. Thank you.
Hi, had a great group, great conversation, and we talked certainly about what's happening in Scarborough, but similar to what Catherine was talking about, we kind of looked at things from perhaps a little bit of a broader perspective. And I think one of the things, particularly in Scarborough, is this sense of that village, those little pockets of or conclaves that are really focused on what's happening there, and how do we pull those out, and again, common theme, bring them together. How do we start to kind of foster those kinds of broader conversations? Listening and getting, and I think Catherine, you said it, John, I think you may have said it. How do we get people that, all of us that may be on a common wavelength and kind of a common thing? That's great. We talk to each other, but how do we get other people involved? How do we draw them out to feel safe in having conversations? I think it's really important that we start to look at what are those things, those little common threads that bring us together. One of the things that Mark said, and I think we talked about it a little bit in our group, is how do we take this great stuff that we're doing in these little pockets here in Scarborough? How do we connect with those bigger groups? Because we connect with the bigger groups, maybe we start to bring more community, and we bring that back in, and maybe we start drawing people out. And it comes down to listening. And we talked a little bit about listening, not to respond, but listening to understand. And we talked quite a bit about that. And how do we have those kinds of conversations? It seems, I think, to me, and I think to the group, the desire's there. And we're going to just have to all collectively work together to find those little nuggets, those little shreds that we can bring ourselves together and start to build on it and build on it and build on it. I think Mark's talk was very inspirational. I think the group had a lot to say. We were a particular group of individuals who are in a different stage of our life where we're not in our 30s, but yeah, we can connect using all of the greatest new tools, which helps bring us all together. So thank you.
Thank you very much to all of our facilitators. We ended up having just 3 virtual groups, even though we had planned to have 4. And so the next facilitators to report out would be Dana and Janice, who are there in the room, in the meeting room. So you all are up. And I think you can tell from listening to these 3 facilitators speaking how lucky we are to have this group of people with us tonight. I wish more people who had been listening to Mark's call had participated in the small group discussion, because you all are amazing. And thank you for such brief but articulate descriptions of your small groups. Okay, Janice.
So one thing you said, Lucy, is this is being taped, or Mark, at least Mark's interview. So people who have listened in and are interested in spreading the word to other people, they could also, I'm assuming, get the recording.
Yes, absolutely. And this part is also being recorded. What the earlier facilitators said has been recorded.
Okay. So our group, some of the themes are a lot the same. The first thing is what are the issues in Scarborough is growth. And we talk about the fact that we were geographically divided and we still are geographically divided, which can have a positive and a negative in that it creates small communities. But because there aren't those common civic spaces enough that people don't get together, that there isn't a way to bridge across those natural divisions, if I wanted to say. Also, with the growth in Scarborough, we're getting a little more social and economic diversity, maybe even some racial diversity, and neither, although that's not negative, it is changing the community. And with the change that's going on and the speed that it's going, and not enough opportunity to come together, we're concerned about a buildup of distrust, and that grows. Distrust of different groups, but also distrust of our government, of our local government. And there was a lot of conversation about how maybe our leaders are not engaging us effectively in the decision making. We're not being informed in a timely manner. We're not being informed in a way and that we can participate in the decision making effectively. So there was a real request, strong desire for more meaningful and effective engagement. So the other thing, since there's this, as we talked about, the difference in our response to growth is some of us are feeling a sense of loss of place because it is big, because it's continuously changing. And then there's those who would like to have the opportunity that some of this growth is offering. So the question comes up, how do we resolve this? Well, we have to have the conversations that we're having now and have them more often and more influential in terms of how the decisions that get made in the community.
Thank you. And one quick thing that I wanted to make a little bit of time for right here at the end. John Anderson wanted to say a couple of words before Catherine does the closing for us.
Yeah, thanks, Lucy, and thank you everybody for coming tonight. You know, it was more just hearing some of the things that both Paula and Janice brought up about, you know, understanding the issues with our culture of having these different neighborhoods. So I just, in case people aren't aware, there is a community-wide survey that's out right now. It's available on the town website and it's open to all individuals within the community to take. It does take 15 to 20 minutes. It's quite a lengthy survey. Don't let that, you know, distract you from taking the survey, but there are a lot of questions in there about growth and development. So it's just another mechanism to have your voices heard and captured. And I think it will be a great tool the more people participate to help guide decision-making and think about the issues that are important, not only in specific geographies, because we'll be able to see that, but also in general across Scarborough. So I would just ask that everybody, if you have 15 to 20 minutes before December 19th, you take some time to complete that survey if you haven't already.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy.
So I just want to thank everyone for coming to the library or joining us from home. I want to thank all of the exceptional facilitators who helped us here at the library and via Zoom. And I want to thank Mark Gerzon for joining us from Colorado. And I hope that we've learned something. We can take something from what Mark said and what we learned in our groups and take it back to our families and to our communities and different organizations we work with, and try to be more open-minded and work on those conversations with people. I want to invite you to come to Sam's Let's Talk America group the first Thursday of every month here at the library at 6 p.m. and get involved in that and meet some other people who are involved in the community. And then also just let us know if you're interested in more conversations like that, to respond to the email that we sent you earlier. And then one final thing is, on our website, we do have a community, under the community section, we do have a list of resources that have been recommended by some of our facilitators and by Mark as well. So once again, thank you for coming, and we hope to hear from you again.
Thanks again, everyone, for coming.
Thank you.